we finally got him talked into doing it, but the only format in which he'd do it is a Q&A, reversing the normal position that Peter normally does with his excellent research on interviewing other people. So Brian Caldersmith, father, has done that tonight, and we'll put the questions towards Robbo. So here you go. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. This is going to be a relaxed format. We're both going to sit down and have a chat. Just briefly, for those that don't know Peter, he's been involved in motorsport, motoring for 56 years as a formal thing. He started as a youngster like all of us, looking and comparing cars. And I don't want to go on about it because Peter's going to tell us tonight. So my first question to him is, how did it all begin?
Well, the first thing I would like to say is to agree with Wayne that this is a most unusual position for me to be in. In fact, I think it's unique. I am normally, as a journalist, a curious journalist, I'm the one who asks the questions. And I find it quite difficult to answer the questions, so please bear that in mind. But it started because I've just been thinking about this, but I cannot remember a time when I didn't love cars. Fortunately, I had a cousin who was 15 months older than I was, and we became great friends. And the love of cars and how cars happen and the difference between cars all stemmed from that. I was also fortunate enough to live on a farm 30 miles north of Melbourne, and that enabled me to learn to drive in a 1950 Land Rover. Not sporting, I agree, not sporting, but it was perfect for the farm. There was no synchromesh on second gear, so you had to hold it in second gear, but it was fine. I then, at the age of 15, decided that all my mates had Chevy 4s or Austin 7s. We're going back a long way, I know. So these are cars from the 20s, and I saved up and finally got the £10 required to buy a 1929 Pontiac, which is illustrated there. Side valve, 6-cylinder engine, of course. Paddock bomb, which went beyond the paddocks and was often used to drive, dare I admit it, on sections of the Hume Highway. Occasionally it would be driven from Wallan to Kilmore to go to the flicks on a Saturday night. And I'm quite sure that the local copper knew exactly what was happening, because the day after I turned 18, I went down to see him. I'd made an appointment to get my driving licence, and I failed. I didn't fail because I couldn't drive. I failed because I didn't know whether a de-restriction sign was white on black or black on white. So he failed me. I turned up the next Saturday, and of course I passed. I then...
How did you get into writing?
Well, I was an average student. I didn't enjoy school very much. And so I really did not have a clue about what I was going to do. And I mean that I didn't know what I would do if I went to university, and if I was to go to university I was going to have to repeat a year. So my mother, my wonderful mother, had this brainwave an idea to write to the only Melbourne motoring magazine, Motor Manual, and ask about a job. And my timing was perfect because there was an opening, and I applied and I got the job. It was a lousy magazine, but it was the start we all need, and you just need a start, and then if you somehow have what it takes to progress, then you will progress, but you need that start. So that is the letter I received from Keith Windsor in very early 1962, and I've been writing about cars ever since, so it's quite a while. So I graduated to my Austin Healey Sprite Mark IIA, which to my mind was the best Sprite. Still had the quarter elliptic rear springs, Borg ring synchromesh gearbox. Second was much higher than it had been on the Mark II, 1098 cc's, I think 56 horsepower. And with Paul Halstead, who created a Holden-powered Alpha Sprint, we used to race around the Kew Boulevard every Friday night from about 11 o'clock. We actually painted a start line and a finish line. And yes, we were never caught. We were never caught. Bob Jane used to use it to run in some of his racing cars. So I then graduated to a Honda S800, which was an engine in search of a chassis. Didn't compare with the handling of the Sprite.
How did you get into wheels?
Well, I went from Motor Manual. I was headhunted to Australia Motorsport magazine, which meant that the staff was doubled, and I was given the job of road testing cars. And at the November 1970 launch of the Austin Tasman Kimberley, Twofold Bay, I met a bloke called Mel Nichols, who was a proper journalist, newspaper trained, who'd moved from the Daily Mirror to Wheels magazine a couple of months beforehand. We got on, we enjoyed each other's company. We seemed to be on the same wavelength. So when Rob Luck resigned from Wheels, Mel put my name forward to work at Wheels. I should explain that photograph. I did also in 1970 compete in the Ampol Round Australia trial. All I can say is we finished, but I was wiped out. So I went up to see Wheels and I got the job, much to my surprise. What I should also explain about the importance of this was that when I was 15, my father would find me reading Wheels magazine and he'd say to me, "Get your bloody head out of that car magazine. You will never earn a living writing about cars." And when I got the job at Wheels, he did have the good grace to say, "Well, I was wrong and you were right." So that's the letter from management at Wheels confirming the appointment. That's the cover of the first issue I did, which was May of 1971. Ironically, given the many dramas that went on between Wheels and Toyota over the years, it featured a Toyota Corolla.
All right, what's the story behind this photo?
Well, this is a photograph of a bunch of blokes taken at Car Magazine's offices in 1984, and everyone in that photograph at one time or another rode for Wheels. So I'm on the left, next to me is Gavin Green, then Davey Robertson, Phil Scott, Steve Cropley, Mel Nichols, John Crawford, Bill Tuckey and Ian Fraser, who was the proprietor of Car Magazine. And I'm a photograph that I'm very fond of.
Now, we've all been chauffeured at some time, either by a taxi driver or maybe to our wedding. But I believe you've been chauffeured by the Prime Minister.
Indeed, Brian, that's quite right. When Ford introduced the LTD in 1976, the LTD was a long wheelbase version of the Fairlane, which was a long wheelbase version of the Falcon. So the wheelbase had been stretched from 111 inches to 121 for the LTD. And Ford said, and I feel quite rightly, that they felt the Prime Minister of Australia should not be driving an imported Mercedes-Benz S-Class, but a Ford LTD. So I thought, okay, well, we'll road test the car between the Lodge and Parliament House, because that's what it's been designed to do. And then we got ambitious, and I thought, well, wouldn't it be great if we could get Malcolm Fraser, then the Prime Minister, to drive the car? So I rang the press department and spoke to some bloke who was completely dismissive of the idea. And I thought, well, all right, well, I won't give up. I'll try again the night before. Warwick Kent, the photographer, I worked with for a decade. Before we left to drive down to Canberra in the LTD, I tried again in the afternoon and there was just no response, very negative. Then at about 10 o'clock at night, they rang and said, he says if he can drive it, he'll do it. So we were astonished, but we set off very early. We arrived at the lodge at just a bit before 8. We were let in, we were expected. There was a security falcon in front of the lodge, which we got out of the way. We suggested they bring the S-Class around, and we stuck the LTD in front of the lodge. Mr. Fraser, he was always Mr. Fraser, came out, said goodbye to Tam. She was always Tam, never Tammy. Came out, gave her a kiss, jumped into the driver's seat of the car, and for 22 minutes, Malcolm Fraser, Mr. Fraser, with Warwick in the back taking photographs, security man also sitting in the back and me sitting in the front with Malcolm. We cruised around Canberra. He didn't like it very much. He much preferred his Lancia Flaminia, and so do I.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. The story appeared in the magazine. It was so late that there was no cover line. But a week later, I happened to be in Canberra on a Volvo trip, and there were a bunch of Americans, and I teamed up with a bloke called David Abrahamson from Car and Driver magazine. We spent the day together, and we arrived back at the Lakeside Hotel, which is where we were staying, and the Mercedes-Benz, the Prime Minister's Mercedes-Benz, was in front of the hotel. So I jumped out, went over and talked to the security guy and also to the chauffeur, and I said, "Is Mr. Fraser in the hotel?" knowing that he would be. They said, "Yes, he should be coming out in a couple of minutes." So I said to David, "Would you like to meet the Prime Minister of Australia?" And he gave me a look that said, "Well, you know, this is just not possible."
Yeah, right.
But sure enough, Mr. Fraser came out. Shouldn't call him Malcolm. Mr. Fraser came out. And I took David over and I introduced them, and they had a chat for about 5 minutes. Mr. Fraser got in the car and off he went. David looked at me, still astonished, and said, "If you come to the United States, please, please do not expect me to introduce you to the President." Because he pointed out that there was no way, if it was the President, that I'd be able to go up to him, as I did, and just start talking to him, that there'd be a helicopter above, there'd be probably at least 10 security people around the President, and that would be the end of it. So it was a good story.
All right, about good stories. What about when you decided there would be no car of the year?
Oh, this has always got me into trouble. I felt, and still do, that if there was no car that was deserving of the Car of the Year award, then we shouldn't award it. And during my 16-year editorship, that happened 3 times. Most famously in 1979, when the Falcon XD was expected to be Car of the Year. In fact, it was simply a reskin of the car that went before it. And so rather cheekily, rather than just have a no Car of the Year cover, we put a lemon on wheels. Ford was a little upset, and a couple of months later they came out with this ad. Can you read the line? "There are times when being a lemon is not a bitter experience at all." It was an ad that ran once in the June 1980 issue of Wheels, and I think it's a fabulous ad. I decided to give a copy to Edsel Ford, great-grandson of Henry I, son of Henry II, to give him a framed copy of both of those pictures. And that now sits on the toilet door of his home in Dearborn.
Now, all right, you were also there for the Brabham Moss Bathurst disaster.
Yes, I felt this story of these two old heroes making a comeback in 1976 was a perfect feature for Wheels. So again, Warwick and I decided that we would simply stick with Jack and Sterling for the weekend, which we did. But of course, on the grid for the start of the race, Jack had problems finding first gear and was hit from behind by a Triumph Dolomite Sprint. The car was very badly damaged, and both the drivers were distraught. They felt that it was all over. But the Bathurst mechanics, being what they are. Got the car back into running order in 2 hours. Jack went out for the first stint, and I want to get the quote exactly right, so please forgive me, I'm going to read it. He came in, he raced it, went over to Betty, his wife, and he said, "I don't feel as if I've ever been out of it. I feel as if I've wasted the last 6 years." And this to the woman who had convinced Jack at the end of 1970 to give up motor racing, much against his own desires. Sterling went out and came back, and he was even more euphoric. His eyes were wide. He was just so excited. And he said to me, "I've had a ball, boy. We all stopped too early. I made a mistake. I should never have retired." Which I thought was just a wonderful quote for the story.
Absolutely.
And a few weeks later, I received that letter from Sterling saying how much he'd enjoyed the story, saying he didn't think that he didn't know if he would ever do it again. But I felt it was fantastic to get a personal letter from someone who'd been a hero a hero of mine during the 1950s.
And you took a Commodore to Europe and the States.
Yes, we did. We did. This was as a result of driving the HSV Commodore, HS Holden Dealer Team, HDT. I'm getting old. We were very impressed with this car. It was a car that Peter Brock and his engineers had tuned. And I thought what we would like to do is to compare it against similar cars in Europe and then the United States and then in Japan. So somehow, I think Mobil put money into it, I'm not sure. But it all happened. So we took it to Europe and we compared it to a M5 BMW, a 190 Evo Mercedes-Benz and a Ford Sierra Cosworth. And the Holden lost quite badly. It was then shipped to New York and I drove it with one of Peter Brock's young blokes to Los Angeles, which made another story. And we were comparing it to 3 American so-called sporting cars, a Mustang, a supercharged Buick, and I can't remember the other one, and the Holden won. What was interesting about that was this car had a polarizer. Do you remember the infamous polarizer?
Oh, that's why I won. Oh,
yeah. So this young man from Brock's organisation insisted, because Peter had told him this was the case, that the car would be perfectly okay on a circuit with 20 psi on the tyres. Well, that was just rubbish. So I would pump them up to 36, he would let them out to 20, I would pump them up again, and this was a game that we played. But nonetheless, with the car on 36, it did win that comparison. But Mr. Brock was not impressed with the result of the first test and wrote to me and said, "We will not be sending the car to Japan. It's over. It's all over."
Pull the plug.
He pulled the plug on the whole thing.
Yeah.
But we all know what happened with the polarizer. It forced the divorce between Peter Brock and Holden.
Why are we not surprised? Yeah. Well, touring across the States in a Commodore, that's not a bad job, but you've done Sydney-Perth a couple of times.
Well, sorry, Brian, I've forgotten about the Falcon.
Oh, yes.
You need to move your pics on, old boy. So when the Ford Falcon with the Burra engine came out, it struck us as being a very, very good car. Very good combination of performance and handling. And I thought, well, okay, I want to see what the European magazines see of it. So we convinced Ford to send it to Europe. We took it to Quattrorotte in Italy. They have their own proving ground outside Milan. We took it to Hockenheim with Automotor and Sport, Auto Hebdo in France. We took it to Monteleri, and with Autocar, we tested it in Europe, in England, and it did very well. And the thing that they could not get over was the value for money that that car represented in Australia. We showed them the relative costs of the Falcon versus cars that they wanted to compare it to, and there was no, the Falcon in Australia was half the price of the cars that it were logical competitors in Europe, so it did very well. Sorry, old boy, you wanted to ask about going to Perth.
Yeah.
When in I think it was 1976, the Commonwealth Games were held in Perth, and the government decided it was a good time to finally seal the Nullarbor plain. So Steve Cropley, my colleague, and I decided what we should do is drive from Sydney to Perth as quickly as we could. Ford built us a Falcon with a 4.9 litre V8, the optional 125 litre fuel tank, tall gearing, 4-speed gearbox, air conditioning. We set off at 2 o'clock one Sunday morning. We were able to get out of Sydney very quickly, and we got to Perth 32 hours later. We averaged, I think, 26 litres per 100k. Steve then went off to Car Magazine in England, but in 1980, Brian Foley rang me up and said, look, I think Alpha owners need to know that they could drive to Perth in 40 hours in an Alpha and have a weekend in Perth and then come back. So he said, I want to take an Alfetta, a Giulietta and a Sud TI. And I thought, well, this is an opportunity to try and break our record. Alfa Romeo Australia agreed. We put an auxiliary tank in the boot of the Alpha. And again, we set off very early on a Sunday morning. And we were able to cruise most of the time at 160. We got to Perth 29 hours, 14 minutes and 9 seconds later. And for the 4,020 kilometres, which is the distance from London to 1,000 kilometres east of Moscow, so it's a big distance, we averaged 136 kilometres an hour, used half the fuel that we had used in the Falcon. So we were pleased with ourselves.
I would think so.
In 2006, I discovered that Jaguar had the only diesel XJ in Perth, and they wanted to get it to Sydney. So I thought, well, this is another opportunity. I knew with traffic congestion, increase in the number of police. At that time, there were police aeroplanes flying over the Nullarbor, booking people. I don't know whether that's still the case. So I thought, well, it's a courtesy to ring Steve just to tell him what we're doing. I did. He got onto Jaguar in England, and his plan was that he would arrive in Perth on Sunday afternoon. We would leave at 4 in the morning on Monday. He would be back in London on Thursday of the same week, and in between he would sit in a Jaguar and drive from Perth to Sydney, which is exactly what happened. But with the traffic, and we got to I think Dubbo middle of the afternoon, so the traffic from there to Sydney was terrible. It was 36 hours. But again, the Jag used half the fuel that the Alpha had used. So this was just an indication of the efficiency of modern engines.
Yeah, amazing. Well, that is about a quick little expose of 16 years in Australia. How did Italy come about?
Oh, Italy. That was the end of the conversation. Except after we'd been touring England for a week or so, we came back, stayed with Mel again, and he offered me the job, a new position as European editor of Autocar magazine. A magazine started as a weekly in 1895 when there were 8 cars in England. This was a new position, and they said you can live anywhere on the continent you like. We do not want you in England. So, of course, there was only one place we wanted to be, and that was Italy. I think they would have preferred us to be in Germany, but the food, the people, the country, the culture, it was always going to be Italy. So, sorry, Brian.
The Magi, how did they...
Well, when we looked at a map of Italy and we thought, well, we need to live somewhere near Verona. And when we told our friends Athol and Aileen Yeomans, Athol was the first editor of Wheels, he said, but you must stay at our place, Santa Stefano. Athol and Ian Fraser, the third editor of Wheels, rented a house from a woman called Camilla Maggi, Contessa Camilla Maggi. And so we did. And you can see that there are two red dots. The first is Colino, which is where we lived for 9 years, and the second is the house that we bought. Oh, yes, thanks, Brian. Next one. So this is Camilla Maggi's estate. That's the villa, and up on the hill you can see there's a little church. That's actually also a house, and that's what Ian and Athol rented, and that was where we stayed. And they said, look, you must go down and see Camilla to pay your respects. So we went down, and we were greeted by Franco the butler, wearing white gloves, walking across the terrace. And this was a terrace that was 50 metres long. This is the back side of the house. We met Camilla and we told her we'd been to see real estate agents. She just laughed and said, you'll never get a house seeing real estate agents. But I have a friend whose son is an architect. He will know how to find you a house, which is what happened. So we found a house on the other side of Colino. This is the inside of Camilla's place. Now I have to explain that Camilla Maggi's husband, Imo Maggi, was the man who started the Mille Miglia in 1927. Three of his mates got together. Imo had been to school with the chap who was second to Mussolini in the fascist party. Imo was a fascist. And he was able, with his contacts, to close the roads between Brescia and Rome and back again. Brescia had held the first Italian Grand Prix, but then those Milanese people came along in the 20s and built Monza and stole the Grand Prix away from Brescia. And the Bresciano felt they needed to have a race, and the Mille Miglia was that race. So Camilla used to have, before, when it was a real race, they would have people come and stay, like the Healy team. Donald Healy's team would come and stay with Camilla. Then it was John Wyer and David Brown, and the Aston Martin team would come and stay. So Peter Collins would be there. Louis Clementaschi would be there, the photographer. John Wyer would be there, the great team manager. This is just to give you an idea that Camilla's place every summer would be a location for motoring events. This is obviously a Bugatti Club meeting. Could we just go back one, please, Brian? When Imo died in 1961, and then the Mille Miglia was revived as a mobile museum, Camilla used to have guests, and oh, it's that way, sorry. That man is Olivier Gendebien, wonderful Belgian racing driver, and that is Louis Clementaschi, a fantastic Formula One photographer during the 1950s. And that is our friend Camilla Maggi. Sorry. So you can go forward. But Moss would stay there. Sterling stayed there for 3 nights before he won the race in 1955, and he felt it always brought him good luck. This is our place, but the place we rented. We were doing a comparison with Autocar, so it's an Aston, a Ferrari and a Jag.
But you became very good friends with Olivia.
We did. On the night before scrutineering, we would have a cocktail party at our place and invite friends, designers, people like Sterling and people like Clementaschi and Gendebien. And Olivier would come down from Belgium for a couple of weeks, so we would have dinner with him. He would come to our place for dinner. And one evening, I think he'd learned that we were friends and he could trust us and he liked us. he told me a story. And the story concerns his son coming home from boarding school at the age of about 10, probably towards the end of the 60s. And they sat down to dinner with Robert, the boy's two younger sisters. And Robert leaned across and said, "Father," he called him Father, "Father, did you ever race at Le Mans?" And Olivier said, "Yes, I did." "Did you ever win the 24-hour race?" "Yes, I did." "Did you win 4 times?" "Yes." The boy said, "Damn, I've lost the bet." One of his friends at school had said, "Your name is Jean de Bien. Is your father the famous racing driver?" And Robert said, "No." He had no idea that his father was a very competitive racing driver. And Olivier went on to explain that in 1962, when he was driving with Phil Hill, with whom he'd won the race, I think, 3 times, he was the first man to win Le Mans 4 times. So that gives you an idea of how good he was. He decided, under pressure from his wife, that this 1962 24-hour race at Le Mans would be his last race, if he won the race. They were leading early in the morning. He came over the brow of a hill. One of the back markers had spun. The car was in the middle of the road. It took some avoidance to escape without damaging the car. And he thought, no, I should retire whether I win or not. Needless to say, they did win. And he retired from the racing, and he told me this, and again I want to read it exactly because this is what he said. "I did not want my children to grow up fatherless. There seemed only 2 choices. One, to die, and you will all know how many racing drivers were killed in that period. The other, to lose. I decided on a third, to stay alive." Tragically, 3 years later, it was his wife, Marie, who was killed driving their Porsche on a wet road. She and Robert hit a tree. The boy escaped unhurt, but she was killed. And Jean de Bien had never got round to telling his children that he'd been a racing driver. No, go back to the other one. So this is it was lunch at our place. That is a replica of Puncher-Lamb 28, I think, which was the works team for the Millimetre at that time. It was owned by Linton Morris, who had the car built, rebuilt, restored, if you like, as a replica of the Lancia team cars.
All right, now, it's this next one that gets me. We've all had friends pop in for a cup of coffee or something. How about this occasion?
Well, this again was our cocktail party. So Sterling, who had been up to Camilla Margie's place on the 40th anniversary of his winning the race, and the local television crews had been there, and we invited Sterling down to have a drink. Came down with Simon Taylor, who was his co-driver. I hadn't expected him to drive down in 722, possibly the most famous and valuable car in the world. So he turns up in a yard. That's my little Lancia Fulvia Coupe and a Vignale-bodied Fiat 850. And I loaned him a copy of my June 1955 issue of Motorsport, which has Sterling and Jenks on the cover. And that is Mossy reading that issue with a smile.
He thinks this is a job. He's being paid for this.
Again, this is the cocktail party. That is Louis Clementowski. That's Linton Morris. Is that Camilla, Erica? No. But they were very informal gatherings, lots of lovely people. There were 20 Porsche designers turned up one year. And I think that was the year when I was photographing a car up at Lake Azeo, which was just north of our place, and I met a bloke who was driving a early Rolls Royce. So I told him about our party, so he came down too. So it was just open house.
Speaking of Clement Tasky,
So this is a shot that really inspired me into a love of motorsport. It was taken by Louis Clement Tasky, who was co-driver with Peter Collins in the Mille Miglia. I think it was 56. I think they finished second. But that just somehow captured my imagination. And then to be able to talk to Louis about it, he took one roll of film, one roll of 36 transparency film for the 1,000-mile race. This is the post-Mille Miglia lunch, which is held in Brescia. So again, that's Olivier, that's Camilla, Phil Hill's half hidden, and that's Alma Hill, who was a fabulous woman. And this is the sort of thing that Italians do just naturally. And I should just go back, I just want to point out, that this is Erica, because we had been competing in the Mille Miglia in a 1930 Fiat. There's a photograph of that later on. In fact, I think it could be the next one. That's it there. That was it was a Palermo registered Fiat. And that is Phil Hill driving a Ferrari. We like that photograph.
Life's tough, isn't it? Well, how was life with Ferrari?
Oh, Brian. It was a constant roller coaster ride. I think I've visited Ferrari probably 50 times in the 16 years we lived there. And every time you went, it was exciting. But the first time I went was in September of 1982, when Erica and I were on holiday with two of our children. And I went off to Ferrari for the day and met a bloke called Luca Matteone, who was a marketing operative with responsibility for Australia. And as we chatted, I became aware that he was getting more and more upset. And finally, he jumped up from his chair and he said, "You're the one, you wrote that story, the worst road test ever." It was a road test, next slide please, Brian. Road test of the Mondial, which was a relatively modern Ferrari. But even in 1982, to take almost 9 seconds to get to 100 kilometres an hour was not what a Ferrari should do. Had all sorts of faults, and we simply wrote objectively about the car, but it upset our friends in Maranello. And of course, that led to my first ban for life. I was, according to Luca Matteone, I was banned for life. I would never drive another Ferrari. This is Fiorano, the famous Italian Ferrari test track, just around the corner from the factory, and that's, well, you spin cars at Fiorano, it's pretty easy. What happened was that Autocar wanted me to drive a new Mondial convertible, but it was only through pressure from Autocar in England via Ferrari of the UK that I was allowed to drive the car. I got 2 laps of Fiorano and was taken out by a test driver on the roads around Maranello. The next time was with a 348 and I got more time on Fiorano, and I was allowed to drive the car when I left the factory, but there was a minder with the car. And the next time, and that is a 456, they asked if we could photograph the car in the lovely soft evening light. And they said, no, you can bring it back at 1 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. So much to Stan Papior's horror, the photographer, I said, we're going to drive this car for as long as we've got it. And so we drove through the night, and you can see Midnight Express. So yes, things got better. And then for the 355, I was borrowing a car for a week. Erica and I took one to England. I took one to Germany to compare to a 911 Turbo. I also took it to Turin to introduce it to some designer friends, one of whom was a bloke called Murray Callum, Ian Callum's younger brother. Murray had always wanted to drive a Ferrari, but didn't want his Ferrari experience to simply be a drive around the block. So we set off, and an hour and a half later, after having explored the mountains north of Turin, we got back. He had run that car as hard and as fast as it would go. He slumped down into his seat and he said, "Now I'm depressed." I said, "Murray, why are you depressed?" He said, "Because I know I'll never be able to afford one." Well, that same man retired as the Vice President of Design at the Ford Motor Company on a 7-figure salary. He could afford a Ferrari. I'm not sure if he's bought one, but I do know that he has a warehouse in Dearborn, perhaps not Dearborn, somewhere in Detroit, which is full of classic cars.
Now, this is a photograph I like. You better explain this one.
Well, do you remember the first time you did 100 miles an hour?
Yes, in my TR. Spencer, not a Testarossa.
Well, I don't remember when I did what I did 100 miles an hour in. I do remember 120, and that was in a XT Falcon GT on the Hume Highway. So I decided what I wanted to do was 200 miles an hour on the road. I've done 200 miles an hour on bowls, but I wanted to do it on the road. The first time I tried was in a 612 Ferrari, got to 192. The second time was in a 599 and got to, I think, 196. And I knew that the last occasion in an F12, because it was my last official visit to Ferrari, it was 2014. They'd given me the car for the weekend. I knew that if I turned up on a particular part of the autostrada, which is a link road between one autostrada and another, which is not very much frequented by traffic, that it was my opportunity. So I wound it out in the gears, got to 320 kilometres an hour, and for those of you who are good with arithmetic, you will understand that that's rounded up is 199 miles an hour. So I failed. But what's lovely is that I think it's only Ferrari who would have a trip computer in the car that registers the fastest speed that you have gone since you reset the trip computer. So that is evidence. That's where I parked the car outside the famous factory. 320 kilometres an hour, but I will never, ever get a chance to do 200 miles an hour on the road. So it's a regret. Sorry? No, I left it for them to see. So these are, that's the 355 in Germany, tested against a 993 turbo and an F50. The F50 is one of the great underrated Ferraris.
I see that you're oversteering again.
Well, why not? Why not? It was the idea of Piero Ferrari, the second son of Enzo, who wanted to really have a Formula One car for the road, and that meant that the V12 engine was bolted to the fiberglass, the carbon fibre chassis, which did create noise issues. And Ferrari never allowed any journalist to ever drive the car with the hardtop on. On the day that I drove it with two other journalists from Germany, two cars, 3 journalists, 3 photographers. We shared the cars in the morning, had a bowl of pasta, and then the Germans left. And I was told that they had gone because the only plane from Bologna to Stuttgart left at 2 o'clock and they had to catch the plane, which meant that I had Fiorano, which is where Schumacher has tested cars and Niki Lauda has tested cars and Gilles Villeneuve has tested cars. I had it for the afternoon in an F50. I did not spin on that occasion, but I had spun earlier in the day. It was a good afternoon.
It's a job. I kept thinking this is a job.
Well, yes.
All right. When did you last visit Ferrari?
Officially, I've been back since, just as a tourist, in 2014. I think what I should explain, and this explains being banned for life twice and being thrown out of the factory on a third occasion, is that Italians, if you are perceived as a friend by Italians, and this applies to every Italian car company, then there is an expectation that you will never be critical of their products. They simply don't understand that you can love the brand, but if you're going to be objective, then you will be critical. And it took years for them to really understand that, and it's true in a couple of cases still today. It's just they take criticism personally. So on the last occasion, which was in 2014, I like to think Luca Montezemolo is a friend. I've shown into the office. He said, well, why don't you sit in my chair? Which I did. And I swear I didn't look at all the papers on his desk. And he sat on a chair away from there, and we had a chat about the car and life in general and Ferrari and so on. And he told me, I asked him how long he expected to be at Ferrari, and he said for as long as possible. 4 months later, he was fired by Sergio Marchionne, primarily because Ferrari was not winning in Formula One racing. And he told me that last year. Erica and I went to Rome, and I had a morning with him, and he explained why he'd been fired and what he was doing and so on. He's now a very wealthy man. He's created a new railway company in Italy. So he's done very well. Fascinating bloke. He's always doing this through his hair. He used to use his fingers to comb his hair. Elegant like any Italian male is. Yes. Oh, and this is what I was presented with. It's one of the front wing end plates from Alonso's 2013 Formula One car. And if you'd like to look at it, it says I'm a competent journalist. So I'm very proud of that. And when Luca gave it to me, I'll admit I teared up.
Well, that's one bit of a car. Now, I've heard that you've been damaging Lambos as well.
Well, yes, thank you, Brian. The Countach was, I think, 17 years old when we got to Italy, and I knew that there was a replacement V12 on the way. So I'd been down to see the PR man, who was Sandro Minari, the fabulous rally driver. I think he's the first world champion rally driver, 1977. Do you people keep up with rallying? And I tried to ingratiate myself with Sandro. I'd done an interview with the chief engineer about the new car, but it then came time to drive it. So in order to have 2 days with the car, I teamed up with an Italian journalist, Luca Ciferri, and an English photographer. And so we turned right out of St Agata. I was driving, there was a Lambo Minder with me, and we set off. We went through Bologna, up into the Apennines and down the Fuda Pass in the opposite direction to which the Mille Miglia was run, still is run. And I will swear I wasn't over driving, but the road goes like this, sweeping downhill. And I came round a corner, there was a little Fiat pickup coming up the hill. I got on the brakes. The bloody thing didn't have anti-lock brakes. Front wheels locked, and it skidded across the road. I thought for a moment it was going to miss, but it didn't. It hit the back of the Fiat Coupe.
Got him.
And I thought, right, well, that's it. We're on the next plane back to Australia. I sat on the side of the road, head in hands. There was a lot of chat which went on because the Lamborghini man had rung the Carabinieri. 4 of them turned up, obviously interested to see this new Lamborghini.
Yeah.
There was a lot of chat. No one was hurt. But no one came over and asked for my passport or my driving licence. And after about 20 minutes, everyone said, "Arrivederci, ciao." They all left. So I asked Luca, "Well, what happened?" He said, "Well, you need to understand 4 things. Most importantly, one of the Carabinieri recognised the Lamborghini driver. They'd been to primary school together and been friends. The second thing to recognise is that the Prova plate, the test plate which was on the car, is only legal if the car is being driven by someone employed by Lamborghini. The third thing is that the Prova plate is only legal within the province in which it's issued. And the fourth thing is the insurance on the Fiat ran out a week ago." So the Carabinieri have suggested you were not driving. The accident happened 100 kilometres away, and it happened 8 days ago. So everyone went home happy.
That's very Italian. Very Italian.
So that's the note I wrote to Sandro the following day. You can pull out the other bit now. So I came home with this, which is a piece of the Lambo, which sits on my wall beside the cover of Wheels. Phil Scott, the editor of Wheels, knew I was driving the car, and he said, mate, we need a shot of with the speedo needle above 300. I said, "Well, okay, Phil, we'll do our best." I did not tell Sandro that was my intention. But I rang him and explained that we hadn't got the shot, but I had crashed the car. He said, "You crashed the car? Did you get any photographs?" I said, "Oh, we got a few." And I told him the story I've just told you. He said, "Just write it like that. Just write that story," which is what I did. And that is the result. We drive Diablo and crash. It's not your normal car magazine cover. Autocar, I was also doing a story for them. I told them, of course, what had happened, and they said, "Officially, we never crash cars," which is complete garbage, of course. But my story was not allowed to mention the accident in the car. That cover has meant that I've been bailed up at least a dozen times by people all over the world who recognise me, point the finger and say, "You're Peter Robinson, you're the bloke who crashed the Diablo." So it didn't end the career, but gave me a degree of infamy.
Now, you've driven the Targa Florio several times, and indeed once with one of the masters.
I had the story of the idea that people should have a bucket list of stories that they'd like to write. One, Steve Cropley drove up to Duns to visit the Jim Clark room, and I decided that what we should do is drive the Targa Florio with Nino Vaccarella, who won the race 3 times. And we took an Alfa SZ, Il Mostro. Erica and I drove down to Sicily, and we drove around, spent a day driving around the track with Nino, lovely bloke. You can just see, I think, that there's a red car there. That is typical of the roads of the Targa Florio. If you've never been to Sicily, all I can do is implore you to go and drive the Targa Florio. And Nino told all sorts of stories. And the thing that astonished me was that here is this man who last raced there probably 30 years beforehand. He still knew every corner, 72-kilometre lap, every piece of Armco, every tree, and he knew when he could accelerate and when he could brake, and he proved it to us. He also told me about being invited to go and meet Enzo Ferrari for the first time. He was a little known, or sufficiently well known, that Enzo wanted to see him. So he was invited to come up to Maranello, and he thought, well, what can I take Enzo Ferrari as a present? And he really struggled with this until someone said, why don't you take a box of red juice oranges? And that was what he did. So this box of oranges sat in his lap On the plane from Palermo to Bologna, he was greeted in Bologna, driven out to Maranello, taken in to see Mr. Ferrari. He gave Mr. Ferrari the box of oranges, and they were immediately sent across the road to Cavallino. And Enzo looked at him and said, "Oranges are not the only good thing that comes from Sicily." So he won 3 times, as I said. At one stage, coming down into Colossano in a P6, I think, he was waving to the crowd. He was leading by a couple of minutes, got on the marbles and crashed. And a chap on the corner had a service station. He rescued him. And when the first time we went to Sicily to do a story on the Targa, we met this man, made a point of going into his little service station. And 21 years later, I went back to do another story on the Targa, and we found this man still alive, but in a wheelchair. And every morning his wife would wheel him out onto the terrace, looking down onto this famous story where Nino had his accident. We arrived in Colossano, and Nino wanted us to try a cannelloni, which is a famous Italian sweet. And Stan Papio, the photographer, said, "Well, I'll stay with the car because I'm worried about camera being stolen." And Nino said, "But you're with me. You can leave the keys in the car. The cameras won't be stolen. They won't be touched." So Stan believed him. We went off to the shop to get the cannelloni, the bar. Word spread very quickly that Nino Vaccarella was in town. There was still a supporters club of Nino's fans, and by the time we got back to the car, there must have been 20 or 30 people around the car. Cameras were still in the car. We did lock it. I wasn't quite that stupid, but we did take the keys. But we knew that if Nino Vaccarella had said it was okay, then it was okay with everyone.
Now, you're a journo. Do you have any journalist heroes?
I do. And I'm sure 2 of them are very familiar to most of this audience. One was William Boddy, WB, the editor of Motorsport magazine for decades, and the other was DSJ, Dennis Jenkinson, who was the Continental correspondent and whose life involved driving from race to race around Europe in his 356, and he then had an E-Type. And he lived a life that, when we read his stories in Australia, just seemed impossibly glamorous. An extraordinary life. And his Continental notes in Motorsport magazine were so vivid, so alive, that he was a hero. Yes, he was a hero. The other fellow is a man called Griff Borgeson, who was one of the great American historians. He wrote for the first issue of Hot Rod, wrote for the first issue of Motor Trend, wrote for Car and Driver. He bought 2 Millers from the Bugatti factory, which were just out the back of the old Bugatti factory, and had them restored. He's written a great many books on Alfa Romeo, on Ferrari. He had one thing which I never had, and that was he had an ability with languages. He spoke Spanish, which he learned in California, French and Italian. He and Jasmine lived initially in Turin, but then bought this extraordinary house, which you can see just in the left photograph, which looks as if it was built 500 years ago. No one has any idea when it was first built.
You've also interviewed Gordon Murray?
Yes, there was something else about. Oh yes, the ability with languages meant that Griff. Sorry. That Griff was able to interview Enzo Ferrari in Italian, Vittorio Iano in Italian, and it just gave him an enormous advantages over monolingual people like me. Yes, Gordon Murray. Gordon, of course, was the McLaren F1 designer for quite a long time, Brabham before that. And it was After the Italian Grand Prix in 1988, which was the only Grand Prix the McLaren team lost that year, Senna hit a back marker in through the chicane, that Ron Dennis, O.J. Mansour, thank you, yes, Gordon Murray and one of their other people were having a drink at the bar in the Linate airport. And despite the fact that they had been beaten, or lost the race rather, Gordon felt it was an appropriate time to talk about what he would like to build, to start a conversation about that car, the McLaren F1. That photograph was taken by Gordon. That's Mel Nichols on the left, Peter Robinson in the middle, and Steve Cropley, the three Australian motoring journalist mafia, as the Poms like to call us. It was taken by Gordon as part of a roll of film of shots of the car which he took for his mum who lived in South Africa. So I'm quite proud of that photograph because it was Gordon Murray who took it.
Now, who's this guy?
Well, this is Peter Stevens, who was another friend and who designed the McLaren F1. Gordon was the engineer. Peter was the designer. Peter and Gordon both loved small, light cars. And Peter used to come down and buy these from a friend of ours, Maurizio Anaboletto, who had a classic car business. And he would convert them into what he called his 395 Barchetta, which is the car on the right. Peter bought and drove back a Fiat 500 from Italy to London, which I think Gordon still has. So I like those two photographs. This is my friend Maurizio's collection of cars, probably 6 or 7 years ago. He's kind of retired now, but still deals in classic cars. Also interviewed, do you want to ask the question? Interviewed Niki Lauda when he came to Australia for the 1985 Australian Grand Prix, the first Formula One race. He actually led for 100 metres before, I think something happened to the car. I don't think he crashed, but he was a terrific bloke to interview. If you got on the right side of Niki, then you were okay. The thing I learned about him was that he still has his first Austrian shilling. He was someone who had a reputation for being mean like you would never believe. The other shot, of course, is Michael Schumacher. Fiat introduced a Fiat Seicento, so a Fiat 600, special edition, Michael Schumacher special edition. And I thought, well, the obvious story is to get Michael to drive it. So we arranged to meet at Mugello, where Michael was testing one of the Formula One cars, and he'd agreed to give us 20 minutes. He was wonderfully cooperative. He squatted down in front of the car, did whatever the photographer wanted him to do, and I'd taken along a black pen and asked Michael to sign the bonnet. And he looked at me and he said, "Whose car is this?" And I said, "It belongs to Fiat." "Do you think you've got permission for me to sign the car?" I said, "Michael, don't worry about it. The car's going to be worth twice as much with your signature on it." He also, I asked him to sign a photograph for a grandson who was a great Michael Schumacher fan and who used to sit up quite late and watch the Grand Prix live in Australia. And Michael said, "Does his mother know? Shouldn't he be in bed? What about school the next day?" So this was a different Michael Schumacher. Just very quickly, I once was fortunate enough to drive a D-Type up the hill at Goodwood, and that was what was at the top. It was a Silver Arrows Benz, a Lancia Ferrari, and a 250F Mazda with a Cunningham Jaguar in the far left. Still haven't been to the revival.
Okay, of all the people that you find that you've been meeting and talking to, Who was the most fascinating?
Easy. Very easy. A man called Ferdinand Piëch. Ferdinand Piëch, the grandson of Ferdinand Porsche, sorry. Ferry was his uncle. Was an engineer at Porsche. He helped in the development of the first of the 911 flat six. The 917 was his car. It was he who convinced Porsche to build as many as the FIFA required to homologate the 917. He became the head of R&D at Audi, and it was he who felt Audi, which went from being, he wanted to take Audi from being a car butcher's bought to a competitor with Mercedes-Benz and BMW, which he achieved, and he did that with cars like the Audi Quattro, the aerodynamic Audi 100, the TT, all the innovative cars that Audi has introduced over the time he's been in charge. He then went to Volkswagen, ran Volkswagen as the CEO, ran the whole group, and then became chairman of the supervisory board. He was a dictator, an egomaniac, someone who people were terrified of. I first met him in 1988, the launch of the Audi V8, and then subsequently interviewed him at motor shows. And you learned that if you asked him a question that required any thought, he could take 30 seconds before he answered. And you quickly learned not to fill the gap, because anyone who filled the gap was just dismissed. So you had to just let him take his time. If you knew, and I mean really knew about the 917, then you were home and hosed, because you could start a conversation about the 917, something obscure about the 917, and he was yours. But his staff were terrified. Sorry Brian, but just to give you an illustration, he decided, despite having the Audi A8, which was a competitor for the S-Class and the 7 Series BMW, he decided Volkswagen should have a competitor in that class. Its code name was the D1, it became the Phaeton. In 1999 at the Frankfurt show, there were a small group of journalists, including me, who he wanted to meet and to talk to about the D1. And he told us that one of the goals, or a number of the goals that he'd given his engineers were that this car should be able to maintain inside the car 22 degrees in 50-degree ambient temperature and at 300 kilometres an hour. This is for a car that was electronically limited to 250. And one of the journalists asked him, well, what if the engineers, not believing that the proposal, what he wanted them to do, said, well, what if the engineers can't do it? And Piëch looked at us and said, I will fire them. We said, and what if the next team can't do it? I will fire them until I can find a team that can do it. So he was a megalomaniac. But I do think that what he wanted to achieve in his life as an engineer and an industrialist, he wanted to overshadow his grandfather, who of course was the man behind the Beetle. And I think he achieved it.
All right, what about Lorenzo Ramaciotti?
Lorenzo Ramaciotti was the design boss at Pininfarina, and one day I was visiting Pininfarina to drive these 4 cars, a Jaguar on the right, Daytona Ferrari, Alfa, and then Lancia. And he was, again, a very charming, very elegant Italian. And so Pininfarina's design studio had a little test track, so I drove all those cars. But it also reminded me of interviewing Leonardo Fioravanti, which is a wonderful name for an Italian car designer. And I got to know Leonardo quite well and did a story with him on the Ferrari Daytona, which he designed in a weekend. And I asked him, is there anything about that car that you would change? Not believing that the Daytona, which I'm sure you all know, is simply a beautiful car. And he grabbed me took me by the arm, took me over, and we squatted down behind the car, and he said, look, the rear C-pillar is 50 millimetres too thick. It should have been thinner. And then he grabbed me by the arm again and took me around to the front and said, look at those turn indicators. They should have been smaller. They should have been smaller. That's all I see when I see a Daytona. And that was what he said. So all he saw were the mistakes.
Why did you leave Italy? How did you leave all that behind?
You want to reduce me to tears? Well, this was our backyard on one day in the early 2000s. Erica and I bought this place in 96, I think. Moved into it in June of 98. And it was the most wonderful house in the world. So that was before, and that was after. But one day I woke up in 2004 and I was expected to drive the 550 kilometres to BMW in Munich, and I just didn't want to do it. For the first time in my life, I didn't want to do it. It's a great piece of motorway, if you know it. The A22 runs from Modena to Verona and up the mountains to Salzburg. And about a few weeks later, I got an email asking if I'd be interested in writing a book about the development of the VE Commodore. And a couple of weeks after that, one of Erica's daughters rang and said, Mum, I think it's time you and Peter came home. So we did. We went back in 2008 and had 9 months in the house. But it was very good. Sorry.
I can understand that, and I think that's a good point to finish this. And Peter, thank you so much.